Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you love stories with unexpected twists, hit that subscribe button because this one is going to blow your mind. It was supposed to be just another quiet afternoon for Sarah Carter. She held Max's harness tightly in her hand as they walked along the sidewalk. Max, a large but gentle Labrador retriever, moved steadily beside her. His ears perked up, always listening. His nose twitched, always aware. Sarah had walked this route many times before. She knew exactly how many steps it took to cross the street. She knew where the curb sloped down and where the sidewalk had cracks. Even though she couldn't see, she felt the world in a way most people never could. The city was alive with noise. Cars honked. People chatted. Somewhere, music played from a shop window. None of it bothered Sarah. She was used to it. But today, something felt different. Across the street, a group of bikers leaned against their motorcycles. Their loud laughter and deep voices echoed through the air. The sound of engines revving made some people glance over, but most just kept walking. Sarah didn't need to see them to know they were watching her. She could feel it. Max walked calmly, his body steady, but Sarah felt the way his muscles tensed ever so slightly. He sensed something too. A rough voice cut through the air. Well, what do we have here? Another voice chuckled. A lost little lady with her puppy. Sarah kept walking. She had learned long ago that the best thing to do with people like this was ignore them. But they didn't stop. One of the bikers whistled. You sure that dog knows where he's going? Laughter followed. It was the kind of laughter that made Sarah's stomach tighten. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't harmless. It was the kind of laughter that meant trouble. Max slowed down just a little. His tail was stiff. His ears twitched. Sarah knew he was on alert. Ignore them, Max. Let's go home, she whispered. But the bikers had other plans. A heavy boot stepped in front of her. The smell of leather and cigarettes filled the air. Relax, sweetheart. No need to be rude. Just having some fun. Sarah stopped. She wasn't scared, not yet. But she was ready. Max stood still beside her, his body solid and unmoving. Sarah took a slow breath. Excuse me, she said calmly. I need to get by. The man didn't move. His friend snickered behind him. You in a hurry or something? He asked. Got an important meeting? Or maybe you're just too good to say hello. Max let out a quiet, low growl. Sarah reached down and placed a hand on his back. I said, excuse me. The man laughed. Oh, feisty, huh? You gonna let your little dog fight for you? Max took a step forward. His head was low, his body tight. Sarah could feel his heartbeat through the harness. It was slow. Steady. Focused. The man reached toward Sarah's arm. That was his mistake. Max moved like lightning. In a blink, he lunged not wild, not uncontrolled, but with precision. His teeth clamped onto the man's wrist, twisting just enough to make him yelp in pain. What the? The man shouted, stumbling back. Max let go immediately but didn't move away. He stood firm, his deep growl rumbling like distant thunder. One of the other bikers stepped forward. Whoa, what kind of guide dog is that? Sarah gave a small, knowing smile. The kind that doesn't forget his training, she said. The bikers exchanged nervous glances. The leader, a tall man with a thick beard, narrowed his eyes. You got a problem, lady? Sarah tilted her head slightly. No, she said. But you do. The bikers didn't understand. Not yet. Max shifted his weight, his muscles tense but controlled. He wasn't just any guide dog. He was waiting. Watching. Calculating. You're bluffing, the leader said. That's just a regular dog. Sarah sighed. You don't get it, do you? She said, her voice calm but firm. Max isn't just a guide dog. He's a retired Navy SEAL K9. He's seen combat, taken down enemies in war zones, and trained with the best soldiers in the world. Silence. The laughter was gone. The air felt heavier. The leader licked his lips. Nah, you're messing with us. Max moved again, circling around them with slow, careful steps. The bikers stiffened. This wasn't a normal dog. Normal dogs didn't move like that. Sarah stood tall, her face unreadable. So tell me, she said, her voice almost a whisper. Are we done here? Derek swallowed hard. The confidence in his face started to fade. Let's get out of here, one of the bikers muttered. And just like that, the gang of bikers who thought they ruled the streets turned and fled. Sarah smirked as the motorcycles roared away. That's what I thought, she whispered. Max relaxed beside her, his tail wagging just slightly. His job was done. A passerby who had been watching from a distance walked over, eyes wide. That was incredible. I've never seen a guide dog do that. Sarah smiled, kneeling beside Max and scratching behind his ear. That's because he's not just any guide dog. He's a hero. Retired, but never forgotten. Max leaned into her touch, his duty fulfilled once again. People assume they can judge by appearances. That a blind woman is weak. That a dog is just a pet. But strength isn't always loud. Sometimes, it walks quietly beside us waiting for the right moment to be seen. And as Sarah and Max continued on their way, one thing was clear. Some battles are won without ever needing to fight. Sarah continued walking as if nothing had happened. Max, now relaxed, moved steadily beside her. The bikers were gone, but the air still held the weight of their presence. People on the street had seen what happened. Some whispered to each other, eyes wide in surprise. Others just hurried along, pretending they hadn't noticed anything at all. Sarah had dealt with people like that before. The kind who would rather look away than step in. She didn't blame them. Most people didn't know what to do when faced with trouble. But she didn't have the luxury of looking away. Max had always been her eyes, but he was more than that. He was her protector. She reached down and gave his head a small pat. Good job, Max, she whispered. Max let out a happy huff, his tail swishing slightly. They kept walking, the familiar rhythm of the city returning around them. The sound of traffic, the occasional beep of a crossing signal, the chatter of people passing by. It was normal. Safe. At least, it seemed that way. A few blocks later, Sarah felt it again. That sensation. That feeling of being watched. Her heart beat a little faster. Max, always aware, stiffened slightly but kept moving forward. Sarah knew better than to panic. Instead, she listened. She focused on the sounds around her. The footsteps behind them. The faint creak of leather. The shuffle of boots on pavement. She wasn't alone. It was them. The bikers. They had followed her. She took a slow breath, her fingers tightening on Max's harness. She could hear at least two of them. Maybe more. They weren't right behind her, but they were close. She wasn't afraid. But she was ready. Max's body stayed steady, but she could feel the energy running through him. He knew something was wrong. He was waiting for her signal. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She tapped the screen and held it to her ear, pretending to make a call. Hey, I'm almost home, she said loudly, making sure her voice carried. Yeah, I'll be there in a few minutes. No, Max and I are fine. Everything's good. It was a trick she had learned a long time ago. Make it sound like someone was waiting for her. Make it clear she wasn't alone. The footsteps behind her slowed. She kept walking. Max's ears twitched. His tail remained low, his muscles still coiled and ready. She turned the corner onto a quieter street. Fewer people. Fewer eyes. The footsteps picked up again. They weren't backing off. Sarah felt the familiar prickle of danger crawl up her spine. She stopped walking. Max stopped too, standing firm beside her. The footsteps behind her hesitated. Then, they stopped as well. Sarah turned her head slightly. "I know you're there," she said, her voice calm but clear. Silence. Then, a rough chuckle. "Well, look at that," a voice said. "She's got sharp ears." It was the leader. The same man Max had put in his place earlier. Sarah let out a slow breath. "Are you following me?" Another voice, lower, raspier. "We were just taking a walk." "Same as you." Max let out a low growl. Sarah could feel the tension in the air. These men weren't here to apologize. The leader took a step closer. "You embarrassed us back there," he said. "Made us look weak." Sarah tilted her head. "No. You did that to yourselves." Silence again. Then, the sound of leather shifting. The unmistakable click of a knife being flicked open. Sarah didn't flinch. She had been in dangerous situations before. But she wasn't alone. Max, still silent, shifted his stance. His growl deepened, more of a warning now. The leader laughed. "You really think your little dog's gonna stop us?" Sarah smiled. "I don't think," she said simply. "I know." The leader took another step forward. And that was the moment Max moved. He lunged, not at the leader, but at the other man. The one with the knife. Before the man could react, Max's jaws clamped down on his wrist, twisting just enough to send the knife clattering to the ground. The man yelped in pain. "Get him off me." The leader took a step back, suddenly unsure. Sarah stayed completely still. Max didn't let go right away. He held firm, making sure the man wasn't going to try anything. Then, just as suddenly, he released him and backed up, standing in front of Sarah like a shield. The man staggered back, cradling his wrist. "That thing is crazy." Sarah smiled again. "No," she said. "He's trained." The leader's face was twisted with anger, but there was something else in his eyes now. Something Sarah recognized. Fear. He looked down at his injured friend, then at Max, whose deep brown eyes were locked onto him, unwavering. He licked his lips, hesitating. Then, he cursed under his breath. "Let's get out of here." The man on the ground scrambled up, still holding his wrist. They both backed away, moving faster and faster until they were gone, their footsteps fading into the distance. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Max turned to her, his tail wagging slightly. She knelt down and ran her hand over his head. "You did good, buddy," she whispered. A soft bark, almost like he was saying, "I know." Sarah stood up and adjusted Max's harness. "Let's go home." This time, she walked without looking back. Sarah moved carefully along the sidewalk, feeling the vibrations in the ground as the deep roar of motorcycles filled the air. The sound was sharp, loud, and full of power. It echoed through the street like thunder, making heads turn. She didn't need to see them to know what was happening. The energy in the air shifted. She could hear the low murmurs of conversation, the scrape of boots against pavement, the occasional metallic clink of a chain or a belt buckle. And then, there was laughter. It wasn't the friendly kind. A group of bikers stood by the side of the street, their heavy motorcycles lined up like a wall of steel. The leader, a tall man named Derek, had a voice that carried like a challenge. He leaned against his black and silver bike, his leather jacket creaking as he shifted. Well, what do we have here? Derek sneered, his voice laced with amusement. Sarah kept moving, her grip tightening slightly on Max's harness. A lost little lady with her puppy. More laughter followed. It was deep, mocking, filled with amusement at her expense. Another biker, a man with tattoos twisting like vines up his arm, let out a sharp whistle. You sure that dog knows where he's going? Max stayed close, his large body steady against her leg. His ears twitched, his tail lowered slightly, but he didn't react. Not yet. Sarah had dealt with men like this before. She knew their type. They liked power. They liked control. And most of all, they liked to find someone weaker than them, someone they thought couldn't fight back. She kept walking, her posture straight, her chin slightly lifted. Ignore them, Max, she whispered. Let's go home. But Derek wasn't done. Boots scraped against the pavement. A shadow moved in front of her, blocking her path. Sarah stopped. She could smell the scent of leather, motor oil, and cigarette smoke. She could hear the steady sound of breathing, the shift of fabric as he crossed his arms. Relax, sweetheart, Derek said, his voice dripping with false charm. No need to be rude. We're just having some fun. The bikers behind him laughed again, but this time, there was something sharper in it. Something less like amusement and more like a dare. Max let out a quiet breath. Sarah could feel his muscles shift slightly beneath her fingers. Something in the air changed. What the bikers didn't realize was that Max was watching. Listening. Calculating. Sarah stood still for a moment, measuring the space around her. She wasn't afraid, but she was careful. Please move, she said simply. Derek chuckled. Oh, come on. No need to be in such a hurry. Let's chat. One of the other bikers took a step closer. Sarah heard the crunch of gravel under his boots. Yeah, the man added. No harm in talking, right? Max's tail stiffened. His body, which had been calm before, became tense. Sarah felt it instantly. He wasn't just standing. He was preparing. She shifted her stance slightly. I said, excuse me. Derek's smirk widened. Feisty. I like that. He reached out, his fingers just barely brushing Sarah's arm. And that was his mistake. Max moved before anyone else could react. With speed and precision, he stepped in front of Sarah, his large frame cutting between her and Derek. His deep, rumbling growl rolled through the air like a storm. The laughter stopped. Derek froze. His hand hovered in the air for just a second before he yanked it back. Whoa, one of the bikers muttered. Sarah kept her hand on Max's back, feeling the heat of his body, the powerful muscles beneath his fur. I wouldn't do that again, she said softly. Derek narrowed his eyes. That dog got a problem. Sarah tilted her head slightly. No. But you might. Max stood firm. He didn't lunge, didn't bark wildly like an untrained dog. He simply stood there, a wall between Sarah and the man in front of her. And his eyes never left Derek. The leader scoffed and took a step back, shaking out his hand like he hadn't just been startled by a dog. Fine, he said, rolling his shoulders. Didn't mean to upset your little pet. Sarah didn't answer. She simply adjusted her grip on Max's harness. Come on, Max. They stepped forward. This time, Derek didn't block her. Max moved with purpose, his body pressed protectively against her leg. His breathing was steady, but Sarah could feel the energy still thrumming through him. Behind them, the bikers muttered to each other. She didn't catch every word, but she heard enough. That dog's weird. Never seen one act like that. Didn't even bark, man. Just watched. Derek said nothing. Sarah didn't need to turn around to know that he was still standing there, watching her leave. Max didn't relax until they were a full block away. Sarah reached down and ran her fingers gently over his head. "Good boy," she whispered. Max let out a soft huff, his tail wagging just slightly. She knew this wasn't over. Men like Derek didn't like losing. They didn't like feeling weak. And Sarah had a feeling they weren't going to just let it go. But what they didn't know, what they still didn't understand, was that Max wasn't just any guide dog. He had a past. A past they were about to regret crossing. Sarah walked forward, her grip on Max's harness firm, her pace steady. She knew better than to rush. If she looked afraid, the bikers would sense it. People like them thrived on weakness. Max remained alert, his large body a shield between her and the world. His paws barely made a sound against the pavement, but she could feel the energy in him. He wasn't just guiding her anymore. He was protecting her. Behind her, the murmurs of the bikers faded. But Sarah knew they were still watching. She didn't need to turn around to feel their eyes on her. "Good boy, Max," she whispered. Max let out a soft huff, his tail wagging once. But even as they moved forward, Sarah's mind stayed sharp. She had been through enough in her life to know when something wasn't over. And this wasn't over. She reached the crosswalk and waited for the signal to change. The distant hum of traffic filled the air, mixed with voices of passing strangers. It was a normal day for most people. Just another afternoon. But Sarah's world wasn't normal. Not today. The light changed. She stepped forward, Max leading her with practiced ease. As she crossed the street, she listened carefully. The sounds of the bikers had disappeared, but that didn't mean they were gone. She kept moving. Block after block, she followed the familiar path toward home. She could hear the rustling of leaves in the trees, the distant bark of a dog, the soft music playing from a nearby cafe. These sounds comforted her. But then something else. A noise that didn't belong. Footsteps. Heavy. Purposeful. Sarah's heartbeat quickened. She wasn't imagining it. Someone was following her. Max's ears twitched. His body tensed slightly. He sensed it too. Sarah kept walking. She didn't want to panic. Panic made people sloppy. It made them vulnerable. Instead, she listened. The footsteps stayed at a distance, just far enough to not be obvious. But she could hear the rhythm of them. The way they matched her steps, almost too perfectly. She turned a corner. So did they. Her grip on Max's harness tightened. "Easy, boy," she murmured. Max didn't make a sound, but she felt his muscles shift. He was waiting for her signal. Sarah took a slow breath. She needed to be smart. She wasn't about to lead them straight to her home. She reached a bus stop and paused, pretending to check her phone. She let the minutes pass, acting as though she were waiting for a ride. The footsteps stopped too. Whoever it was, they were still there. Sarah made her decision. She turned around. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice even. Silence. Then a low chuckle. "Sharp ears," a familiar voice said. Her stomach clenched. Derek. She hadn't heard his bike. He must have parked it somewhere and followed on foot. Sarah kept her expression calm. She had dealt with worse than him. "What do you want?" she asked. Another chuckle. "Relax," Derek said. "I was just curious." "About what?" "About you." Sarah didn't move. "That was an interesting little stunt back there," Derek continued. "Your dog. Not exactly normal, is he?" Sarah felt Max shift beside her. He was ready. "He's just a guide dog," she said. Derek scoffed. "Yeah, right." Sarah didn't reply. She knew his type. If she gave him an inch, he'd take a mile. "So," Derek said, stepping closer. "Where'd you get a dog like that?" "That's none of your business." Derek let out another low chuckle. "Feisty," he muttered. "I like that." Sarah kept her breathing steady. She had heard those words before. The way men like Derek thought they could push and push until they got what they wanted. But she wasn't helpless. And Max? Max was waiting. "Listen," Derek said, his voice turning smoother, as if he thought charm would work on her. "I don't want any trouble. Just a conversation." Sarah smiled slightly. "Funny," she said. "Because I don't believe you." Derek's fake friendliness disappeared. His voice dropped lower. "You embarrassed me back there," he muttered. Sarah tilted her head. "I didn't do anything. You made me look weak in front of my guys." "Then maybe you are weak," Sarah said simply. Derek's body tensed. Max let out the smallest, softest growl. Derek took a slow breath. "You've got a smart mouth, lady," he said. "And you don't know when to walk away," Sarah shot back. Derek's jaw tightened. Then, suddenly, he moved. It was fast, too fast for most people to react. But Max? Max had been waiting. Before Derek's hand could reach Sarah's arm, Max lunged. Not wildly. Not out of control. Precise. Trained. His jaws locked around Derek's wrist with calculated force, not enough to break the skin, but enough to send a very clear message. Derek froze. His breath hitched. Sarah didn't move. Max held firm, his body still as stone. His growl was low, deep, vibrating through the air. Derek's face turned red. His other hand twitched like he wanted to grab something, maybe a weapon. Sarah spoke first. "I'd think very carefully about your next move," she said. Derek's jaw clenched. Max tightened his grip slightly. A bead of sweat dripped down Derek's forehead. Then, slowly, carefully, he stepped back. "Call off your dog," he muttered. Sarah didn't say a word. Max released him. Derek snatched his hand back, rubbing his wrist. His face was twisted with rage, but beneath it fear. "You crazy," he started, but Sarah cut him off. "I suggest you walk away," she said. Derek stared at her. Then, he did just that. Sarah waited, listening as his footsteps grew fainter and fainter until they disappeared entirely. Only then did she let out a slow breath. Max leaned against her leg, his body still warm with energy. Sarah knelt down and stroked his head. "You're amazing," she whispered. Max licked her hand, his tail wagging just a little. Sarah straightened. She wasn't shaken. She was prepared. And if Derek or anyone else ever tried again, they would regret it. Sarah stood her ground, her hand steady on Max's harness. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her face remained calm. She had been through worse. She wasn't afraid. The air was thick with tension. The bikers had gone from laughing to something else, something darker. The street was quieter now. People were nearby, but they weren't paying attention. No one was coming to help. Sarah sighed, her voice firm. "I suggest you move." Derek let out a low chuckle. "Or what?" he sneered. "Your little dog gonna bite me?" Max didn't move. His stance was strong, his paws planted firmly on the ground. His eyes locked onto Derek. His tail, which had been relaxed before, was now stiff. He wasn't playing. Sarah didn't answer. She just stood still, waiting. Derek smirked. He thought he was in control. He thought she was weak. "You really think I'm scared of a dog?" Derek scoffed. One of the other bikers, a man with a shaved head and a deep scar along his cheek, stepped closer. His boots scuffed against the pavement. "I bet he's all bark, no bite," the man said, smirking. Max's ears twitched. His muscles tensed. Then, the biker made his mistake. He reached out for Sarah's arm. It happened in an instant. Max moved fast, too fast for them to react. His teeth latched onto the biker's wrist with precision, not fury. He didn't tear. He didn't maul. He held tight, twisting just enough to make the man let go. The biker yelped in pain, stumbling backward. "What the?" he shouted. His face twisted with shock. Max released him immediately and stepped back, his body tense, his deep growl rolling through the air like distant thunder. The other bikers took a step back. Their laughter was gone. "Whoa, what kind of guide dog is that?" one of them stammered. Sarah gave a small, knowing smile. "The kind that doesn't forget his training," she said. Derek's smirk vanished. His eyes darkened. He had no idea who he was dealing with. But he was about to find out. Max stood beside Sarah, his body still, but his sharp eyes watching. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't barking wildly like an untrained dog. He was waiting. Measuring. Calculating. The biker who had been bitten held his wrist, rubbing it. "That thing is dangerous," he spat. Derek took a step forward. He wasn't laughing anymore. "So, you think you're tough?" he said to Sarah, his voice low. "Hiding behind a dog." Sarah didn't flinch. "I'm not hiding," she said simply. "I don't need to." Derek clenched his jaw. He didn't like this. He was used to people being scared of him. He was used to people backing down. Sarah wasn't backing down. And Max? Max was ready. Derek exhaled sharply. "All right," he said. "Fine. You got a tough dog." Sarah didn't move. She knew better than to let her guard down. Derek's hand twitched. And then, he lunged. He moved fast, reaching toward her shoulder, thinking he could grab her before she reacted. But Max was faster. With a sharp, controlled movement, Max lunged forward, snapping his teeth just inches from Derek's hand. Derek jerked back like he had touched fire. His eyes widened for just a second. Max didn't move forward again. He simply stood there, his deep growl steady. Derek stared at him. For the first time, his confidence shook. Sarah tilted her head. "I'd rethink that," she said. Derek swallowed hard. The other bikers watched in silence. The energy had shifted. Sarah turned slightly. "Come on, Max," she said. She walked forward. Max stayed close, his body pressed against her leg. His job wasn't done. Not yet. Derek didn't try to stop her. But she wasn't foolish enough to think it was over. As she passed, she heard one of the bikers whisper, "Man, what is that dog?" Derek didn't answer. Sarah walked forward, her senses still sharp. Max's ears flicked, always listening. Only when they were a block away did she exhale. She reached down and ran her fingers through Max's fur. "Good boy," she whispered. Max let out a quiet huff, his tail wagging just slightly. Sarah kept walking. But she had a feeling. She had embarrassed Derek. And men like Derek never let things go. This wasn't over. Not yet. Sarah kept walking, her pace steady. The world around her felt normal again. Cars passed, people chatted, and a light breeze rustled through the trees. But she knew better. Normal didn't last long when men like Derek felt threatened. Max walked beside her, his large, warm body brushing against her leg. He had done his job, but he wasn't relaxed. She could feel the tension still in him. His ears twitched with every distant sound. His nose lifted slightly, catching the scents carried by the wind. Sarah wasn't afraid. She had learned a long time ago that fear didn't help. But she was alert. She knew Derek. Not personally, but she knew his type. He wasn't the kind of man to back down. He wasn't the kind to forget. He had been embarrassed, and men like him always needed to win. And that meant one thing. He was going to come back. Sarah made a decision. She wasn't going to walk straight home. If Derek and his bikers were watching her, she didn't want them knowing where she lived. She turned left instead of right, taking a longer path, one she didn't usually take. Max didn't hesitate. He followed her lead. She listened carefully. The distant hum of traffic. The rustling leaves. The footsteps of a couple walking nearby. And then something else. A sound that didn't belong. Footsteps. Heavy boots. More than one person. Sarah's heartbeat picked up. They were following her. She kept walking, her body steady. She didn't want them to know that she knew. She counted her steps, feeling the pavement change beneath her feet. The familiar landmarks in her mind told her where she was, a quieter street with fewer people. Not a good place to be followed. Max knew it too. His ears pinned back slightly. His muscles tensed. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. But he was ready. Sarah took a slow breath. She needed to stay calm. Panic led to mistakes. She reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone. She pressed a random button and held it to her ear, pretending to make a call. "Hey," she said loudly, as if talking to someone. "Yeah, I'm on my way home now." "No, I'm not alone. Max is with me." She paused, pretending to listen. "Yeah, I'll see you in a few minutes," she continued. "Oh, you're already waiting outside. Great." She hoped the bikers could hear her. She wanted them to think someone was expecting her. The footsteps slowed. Then, they stopped. Sarah kept walking. Max's body was still tense, but she could feel him listening, waiting for her signal. She turned the next corner and kept moving. She didn't hear the footsteps anymore. Had it worked? She reached a bus stop and sat down on the bench, pretending to wait. Max sat beside her, his big eyes scanning the street. She listened. Nothing. She exhaled slowly. Maybe they had given up. Maybe Derek had decided she wasn't worth the trouble. But then. A deep voice. "You really think you're smart, huh?" Sarah's stomach tightened. Derek. She didn't react right away. She let the silence hang between them. She wanted him to talk first. Derek chuckled. "That little phone trick? Cute." Sarah's fingers tightened on Max's harness. She wasn't alone. Max was with her. And Max wasn't afraid. Derek took a step closer. "You embarrassed me back there," he muttered. "Made me look weak." Sarah tilted her head slightly. "No," she said. "You did that to yourself." Silence. Then, she heard the sound of knuckles cracking. Max let out a low, steady growl. Derek exhaled sharply. "You think that mutt's gonna stop me?" Sarah gave a small smile. "I don't think," she said. "I know." Derek's jaw clenched. Then, he moved. He was fast. Faster than she expected. But Max was faster. The moment Derek lunged, Max exploded into action. With a sharp bark, he lunged forward, not wildly, but with precision. He didn't bite. Not yet. Instead, he blocked. His powerful body slammed between Derek and Sarah, knocking Derek off balance. Derek stumbled back, his eyes wide. "What the?" Max didn't stop. He advanced slowly, his body low to the ground, his eyes locked on Derek like a trained soldier locking onto a target. Derek took another step back. Sarah didn't move. Max let out a deep, thunderous growl. Derek's breathing was uneven now. She could hear it. "You don't get it," Sarah said, her voice quiet but firm. "Max isn't just any dog. He's a retired Navy SEAL K9. He's been trained to take down men twice your size." Silence. Derek licked his lips. One of the other bikers muttered, "No way. She's bluffing." Sarah took a step forward. Max moved with her, his head low, his eyes still locked onto Derek. "You want to find out?" Sarah asked softly. Derek swallowed. Then, he did something surprising. He laughed. It wasn't real laughter. It was forced. Nervous. He shook his head. "You got lucky today," he muttered. He took another step back. Then another. His friends followed. A second later, the sound of motorcycle engines roaring to life filled the air. Sarah waited. Max waited. Only when she heard them right away did she exhale. She knelt down, running her fingers through Max's fur. "You did amazing," she whispered. Max let out a happy huff, his tail wagging slightly. Sarah straightened. She knew this wasn't the last time she would run into men like Derek. But now, Derek knew who she was. And more importantly, he knew who Max was. And that was something he would never forget. "You don't get it, do you?" Sarah continued, her voice calm but firm. "Max isn't just a guide dog. He's a retired Navy SEAL K9. He's seen combat, taken down enemies in war zones, and trained with the best soldiers in the world." Silence. The bikers froze. They looked at each other, shifting uncomfortably. Some of them let out nervous chuckles, but it wasn't real laughter. It was forced. Uneasy. Derek scoffed. "Nah, she's bluffing." But Sarah didn't blink. She stood there, steady, her fingers resting lightly on Max's harness. She wasn't scared. She wasn't angry. She was just waiting. Then Max moved. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. He acted. In one smooth motion, he circled behind Derek, his movements sharp and deliberate. His paws barely made a sound on the pavement, but his presence was undeniable. Derek stiffened. Max wasn't just standing guard. He was positioning himself. The bikers saw it now. This wasn't an ordinary dog. This was a trained operative. Max's deep brown eyes locked onto Derek, unblinking. He was studying him, calculating. His stance was strong, his body steady. He wasn't just reacting. He was controlling the situation. Derek swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. His bravado was slipping. Sarah tilted her head slightly. "So tell me," she said, her voice soft but full of confidence. "Are we done here?" Derek hesitated. His fingers twitched like he wanted to reach for something, maybe a weapon, maybe just a way to feel like he was still in control. Max took a step closer. Derek flinched. The bikers saw it. Their leader, the one who always walked with a smirk, who never backed down, had just flinched because of a dog. And not just any dog. A dog that knew exactly what he was doing. A dog that could take him down in an instant. Let's get outta here," one of the bikers muttered. Another one nodded. "Yeah, man, forget this." Derek's jaw clenched. His pride was bleeding, but he wasn't stupid. He could feel Max's breath near his leg, could see the way the dog had moved with purpose. This wasn't a fight he could win. Without another word, Derek took a slow step backward. Then another. Max didn't move. He watched. The bikers turned, their boots scraping against the pavement as they hurried toward their motorcycles. Engines roared to life. Derek hesitated for just a second longer. He turned back to Sarah, his face tight with anger. "This isn't over," he muttered. Sarah smiled. "Oh, I think it is." Derek scowled. Then he climbed onto his bike, revved the engine, and sped away. One by one, the other bikers followed. And just like that, the gang of men who had thought they ruled the streets, who had laughed at her, who had underestimated her fled. Sarah let out a slow breath. Max exhaled softly beside her, his body relaxing for the first time. She reached down and stroked his head, her fingers moving through his fur. "Good boy," she whispered. Max leaned into her touch, his tail wagging slightly. A few people had stopped to watch, whispering to each other. A woman with a shopping bag shook her head in amazement. A man in a suit muttered something about how he'd never seen a dog move like that before. Sarah didn't say anything. She just stood there, calm, steady, in control. Because she had never needed saving. She had Max. And Max had her. Sarah took a deep breath, standing still as the sound of motorcycles faded into the distance. The street slowly returned to normal. People walked past, cars hummed along the road, and the world continued as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Derek and his gang had learned a lesson they would never forget. Sarah reached down and ran her fingers through Max's thick fur. His body was no longer tense, but he was still alert, his ears twitching, his head slightly raised. He wasn't just a pet. He wasn't just a guide dog. He was a protector. "Let's go home, buddy," she murmured. Max gave a soft huff, as if to say, "Finally." She turned and started walking again, her hand firm on Max's harness. Her heart was still beating fast, but she kept her pace steady. She wasn't scared. Not anymore. She had won. But even as she walked, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered a warning. Was it really over? Derek had left. He had been humiliated. But Sarah knew men like him. He wouldn't just let it go. He would come back. And next time, he wouldn't be so quick to run. Sarah sighed, shaking off the thought. She wasn't going to live in fear. If Derek came back, she would be ready. Max would be ready. She turned down a quieter street, one she always took on her way home. The sidewalk was lined with small trees, their leaves rustling in the light breeze. Max walked beside her, his body steady, his head high. But after a few minutes, he slowed down. Sarah frowned. Max never slowed down unless something was wrong. "Max," she whispered. He didn't respond. But she could feel his muscles tense under her fingers. Her breath caught in her throat. She listened. The city sounds were still there, the hum of distant traffic, the chatter of pedestrians. But underneath it? Footsteps. Heavy. Slow. Deliberate. She wasn't alone. Sarah kept walking, forcing herself not to panic. She counted the steps. Listened to their rhythm. There were at least 2 people. Maybe 3. They were following her. Her fingers tightened on Max's harness. She turned the next corner, leading Max toward a small cafe. If she could get inside, she would be safe. There would be people. Cameras. But as she took another step, she heard it. A low, deep laugh. Derek. Sarah stopped. Max stood still beside her, his body solid as a rock. "Did you really think we were done?" Derek's voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it now. He wasn't playing anymore. Sarah turned slightly, keeping her face calm. "I thought you learned your lesson." Derek scoffed. "You think one little dog scared me off?" Max growled. Derek's voice faltered for just a second. But then he chuckled again. "Oh, come on. You don't really think I'm just gonna walk away, do you?" Sarah's heart pounded, but she didn't let it show. She refused to give him the satisfaction. "You should," she said simply. Derek took a step closer. Max moved instantly. He stepped in front of Sarah, his growl low and dangerous. Derek stopped. Sarah almost smiled. "You keep talking," she said, "but Max doesn't need to talk." Derek's jaw tightened. "You don't scare me," he said. But his voice was different now. Less sure. Sarah tilted her head slightly. "Then why are you hesitating?" Derek clenched his fists. "Because Max moved. Not forward. Around." With smooth, precise steps, he circled behind Derek just like before. Derek stiffened. The other bikers, two of them, standing a few feet back, shifted uncomfortably. They could see it now. Max wasn't reacting. He wasn't barking wildly like an untrained pet. He was thinking. Calculating. And waiting for Sarah's command. Derek licked his lips. "You're bluffing," he muttered. "He's just a dog." Sarah sighed. "Still don't get it, do you?" Derek didn't answer. Max took another step. Derek flinched. Sarah smiled. "You should leave now." One of the bikers muttered, "Maybe we should just go, man." Derek snapped his head toward him. "Shut up." But the damage was done. The bikers were losing confidence. Sarah could feel it. Max could feel it. Derek's hands twitched. Sarah held her breath. And then Max let out one single bark. Loud. Powerful. Final. Derek jumped back. The other bikers turned and ran. Derek was alone. He stood there, breathing heavily, his fists clenching and unclenching. Sarah took a slow step forward. "So tell me," she said, her voice calm. "Are we done here?" Derek swallowed. Then, without another word, he turned and ran. Sarah let out a slow breath. Max stood beside her, his tail flicking once. She knelt down, running her fingers over his head. "Good boy," she whispered. Max wagged his tail. A few people nearby had stopped, watching in shock. A man in a business suit shook his head in disbelief. "That dog is something else," he muttered. Sarah smiled. "Yeah," she said softly. "He is." She straightened, exhaling slowly. Derek wouldn't be coming back. Not after this. She had won. She turned toward home, walking forward with confidence. Max trotted beside her, his job done. Because strength wasn't always loud. Sometimes, it walked beside you silent, steady, and ready for anything. Sarah smirked as the motorcycles roared away, their engines fading into the distance. The gang that once stood tall, laughing and sneering at her, had now turned their backs and fled. "That's what I thought," she whispered, shaking her head slightly. Max stood beside her, his strong body finally relaxing. His tail wagged just a little, not in excitement, but in quiet satisfaction. He had done his job. His mission was complete. For a moment, Sarah just stood there, breathing deeply, letting the moment settle. She knew the power she and Max had just shown. They weren't helpless. They weren't weak. And now, Derek and his gang knew it too. She knelt down beside Max and ran her fingers through his thick fur. "You did amazing," she murmured, pressing her forehead against his. Max huffed softly, almost like he was saying, "Of course I did." A small crowd had gathered, some people having stopped to watch from a safe distance. Now, with the bikers gone, they hesitantly stepped closer. A middle-aged man in a business suit adjusted his tie and shook his head. "That was incredible. I've never seen a guide dog move like that." A woman holding a grocery bag nodded in agreement. "That dog isn't normal," she said, her voice full of awe. "Where did you train him?" Sarah smiled, still kneeling beside Max. "That's because he isn't just any guide dog," she said. "He's a hero. Retired, but never forgotten." Max leaned into her touch, his golden fur warm under her fingertips. His job was done. His duty, once again, fulfilled. A young boy, no older than 10, tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom, I want a dog like that." His mother chuckled. "I think that's a special kind of dog, sweetheart." Sarah stood up, dusting off her jeans. She didn't need to say anything else. She didn't need to explain. Max had already proven himself. As the small crowd slowly dispersed, Sarah turned back toward the sidewalk, ready to continue home. Max walked beside her, his pace easy, his head held high. "Let's go, buddy," she said softly. They walked in silence for a while, the city around them returning to normal. But Sarah knew that nothing about today had been normal. Derek and his gang had learned a lesson they wouldn't forget. And more importantly, Sarah had reclaimed her power. She wasn't just a blind woman walking with a guide dog. She was strong. She was in control. And she had Max. As they reached the next intersection, Sarah felt Max slow down, signaling that they needed to stop. She reached out, touching the familiar textured pole beside her. The traffic light beeped, letting her know it was safe to cross. Max led the way, steady and confident. Just as they stepped onto the curb, she heard footsteps running up behind her. "Excuse me." Sarah turned slightly. A woman, out of breath from jogging, stopped beside her. "Sorry, I saw what happened back there. With the bikers." Sarah tilted her head, waiting. The woman hesitated. "I just wanted to say, that was amazing. I mean, what you did. And your dog." She shook her head in disbelief. "I've never seen anything like that before." Sarah smiled. "Thank you." The woman exhaled and laughed a little. "I guess I just assumed, that a guide dog is just for walking." Sarah nodded, understanding. "Most are," she said. "But Max is different." The woman knelt down slightly, glancing at Max. "Can I?" Sarah nodded. "If he lets you." Max sniffed the woman's hand, his tail wagging slightly in approval. She gently scratched behind his ears, grinning. "He's so calm now," she said. Sarah chuckled. "He knows when the job is done." The woman stood up. "Well, you two take care. And thanks for proving that not all heroes wear capes." Sarah grinned. "Some wear fur." The woman laughed and waved before walking away. Sarah turned back toward home, her heart lighter than it had been all day. The adrenaline was finally wearing off. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breath slowed. She had stood her ground. She had won. And most importantly, she had proved to herself that she was never truly alone. Max was always by her side. He always had been. And he always would be. As they reached their apartment building, Sarah pulled out her key and unlocked the door. They stepped inside, the familiar warmth of home surrounding them. She set down her bag and knelt beside Max, pulling him into a hug. "Best partner ever," she whispered. Max licked her cheek, his tail thumping against the floor. Sarah laughed, standing up and stretching. "All right, let's get you a treat." Max perked up, following her to the kitchen. She reached into the cupboard, grabbing his favorite chew bone. "You earned this, buddy." Max took it eagerly, settling onto his bed with a content sigh. Sarah sat down on the couch, running a hand through her hair. Today had been a test. But she had passed. She had faced danger, and she had overcome it. With Max by her side, she knew she could handle anything. And as she leaned back, letting herself finally relax, she smiled. Justice had been served. And Sarah and Max had won. Sarah sat on the couch for a long moment, letting the events of the day sink in. The weight of what had happened finally settled in her chest. Derek and his gang had thought they could intimidate her. They had believed she was weak. They had been wrong. She ran her fingers over Max's soft fur as he lay beside her, chewing happily on his well-earned treat. His job was done. For now. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last time she would have to prove herself. Derek had run, but men like him never forgot being embarrassed. She sighed, rubbing her temples. She knew she needed to prepare. Just in case. Max finished his treat and stretched out beside her, resting his big head on her lap. She smiled, scratching behind his ears. "You really are something special, you know that," she murmured. Max gave a soft huff, as if to say, "Of course I know that." Sarah chuckled. "I guess I shouldn't be surprised. You've always had my back." Her mind drifted back to when she first met Max. Back then, she hadn't known who he really was. She had thought he was just a guide dog. She had been so wrong. It had been nearly 2 years ago when she had first walked into the training facility. She had lost her sight completely a year before, and adjusting to her new life had been hard. She had resisted getting a guide dog at first, thinking she could manage on her own. But the world had other plans. She still remembered the day she met Max. She had walked into the facility, feeling nervous, uncertain. The air smelled of clean floors and dog fur. She had heard trainers speaking in calm voices, the occasional bark echoing through the halls. Then, she had felt it. A presence. Strong. Steady. Warm breath against her hand. She had reached out and felt the thick fur of a Labrador retriever. "Sarah, this is Max," the trainer had said. "He's special. He's going to change your life." She hadn't understood at the time. Not until the first test. Most guide dogs were gentle, patient, designed to help, not to protect. But Max? Max had been something else entirely. She had been walking through the training course, learning to trust him, when a trainer had pretended to grab her arm, suddenly testing Max's reaction. And Max had moved like lightning. Not to bite. Not to hurt. But to stop. To protect. To defend. That was when she had first asked, where did Max come from? The trainers had been hesitant to tell her. But in time, she learned the truth. Max wasn't just a guide dog. He was a retired Navy SEAL K9. A war hero. He had been trained to sniff out explosives, to take down armed enemies, to protect soldiers in the most dangerous places in the world. And now, he was hers. She had never understood why they had chosen him for her. Until now. Now, she knew. She ran her fingers through Max's fur, a deep sense of gratitude filling her heart. "Thank you," she whispered. Max didn't respond. He didn't have to. Because she knew. She sighed, sitting up. Tomorrow, she would go back to her normal routine. She wouldn't let today's events change how she lived her life. But she would be ready. She glanced toward the window, where the city lights flickered in the distance. Somewhere out there, Derek and his gang were licking their wounds, trying to figure out what had just happened. Maybe they would come back. Maybe they wouldn't. It didn't matter. Because next time, Sarah wouldn't just be ready. She would be waiting. She got up, stretched, and turned off the lights. Max followed her to the bedroom, settling into his usual spot beside her bed. As she lay down, she felt safe. She felt strong. Because Max wasn't just her guide dog. He was her guardian. Her protector. And if anyone ever tried to hurt her again, they would regret it. Because Max never forgot his training. And he would never let her down. She closed her eyes, a small smile on her lips. Justice had been served. And Sarah and Max had won. Again. And they always would. People assume they can judge by appearances. That a blind woman is weak. That a dog is just a pet. They see what they want to see. A woman holding a harness. A dog walking beside her. They think they understand. But they don't. Because strength isn't always loud. It isn't always fists, muscles, or shouting. Sometimes, strength is calm. Sometimes, it walks silently beside you, steady and unshaken, waiting for the right moment to be seen. Sarah knew that now more than ever. She had faced men who thought they were stronger than her. They had laughed. Mocked. Tried to scare her. They thought she would break. But she didn't. Because she had Max. And Max wasn't just a dog. He was a soldier. He was a protector. He was her greatest strength. The world saw a simple guide dog. But Max knew better. He had spent years in war zones. He had stood beside some of the toughest men in the world. He had saved lives. And now, his mission wasn't over. Because Sarah needed him. And he would never fail her. Sarah walked forward, her steps steady, her heart light. She wasn't afraid. Not of men like Derek. Not of the world. Because strength wasn't about sight. It wasn't about fists or words. It was about trust. It was about knowing who you are and what you stand for. Sarah knew she was not weak. She had walked through darkness and found her own light. She had been underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed. But none of that mattered. Because she had won. And she hadn't needed fists. She hadn't needed violence. She had simply stood her ground. And that was enough. Some battles are won without ever needing to fight. Sarah smiled. Max wagged his tail. And together, they walked on unstoppable. People assume they can judge by appearances. That a blind woman is weak. That a dog is just a pet. They see what they want to see. A woman holding a harness. A dog walking beside her. They think they understand. But they don't. Because strength isn't always loud. It isn't always fists, muscles, or shouting. Sometimes, strength is calm. Sometimes, it walks silently beside you, steady and unshaken, waiting for the right moment to be seen. Sarah knew that now more than ever. She had faced men who thought they were stronger than her. They had laughed. Mocked. Tried to scare her. They thought she would break. But she didn't. Because she had Max. And Max wasn't just a dog. He was a soldier. He was a protector. He was her greatest strength. The world saw a simple guide dog. But Max knew better. He had spent years in war zones. He had stood beside some of the toughest men in the world. He had saved lives. And now, his mission wasn't over. Because Sarah needed him. And he would never fail her. Sarah walked forward, her steps steady, her heart light. She wasn't afraid. Not of men like Derek. Not of the world. Because strength wasn't about sight. It wasn't about fists or words. It was about trust. It was about knowing who you are and what you stand for. Sarah knew she was not weak. She had walked through darkness and found her own light. She had been underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed. But none of that mattered. Because she had won. And she hadn't needed fists. She hadn't needed violence. She had simply stood her ground. And that was enough. Some battles are won without ever needing to fight. Sarah smiled. Max wagged his tail. And together, they walked on unstoppable. As Sarah and Max continued on their way, The city around them moved as if nothing had happened. Cars passed. People talked. Life carried on. But Sarah was different now. She had always been strong. But now, she knew it. She had faced fear, stood against it, and walked away victorious. Not because she was bigger. Not because she was louder. But because she had never backed down. And because she had Max. She ran her fingers through his fur as they walked. "What would I do without you?" she murmured. Max let out a soft huff, his tail wagging slightly. Sarah chuckled. Yeah, I know. You're the best." Max was the best. He wasn't just a guide dog. He wasn't just a pet. He was a guardian. A warrior in fur. And the best partner she could have ever asked for. Sarah had once thought she was alone. She wasn't. She had Max. And together, they were unstoppable. Sarah reached her apartment, unlocking the door and stepping inside. Max followed, his ears still twitching, always listening. She set down her bag and turned on the lights. The familiar scent of home wrapped around her like a warm blanket. It was peaceful here. Safe. She knelt beside Max, running her fingers along his side. "You did good today," she whispered. Max leaned into her touch, pressing his nose against her shoulder. Sarah smiled. He didn't need to say anything. She knew. She stood up, stretching. It had been a long day. Tomorrow, she would wake up and go about her life. But she would never forget today. Because today, she had proved something. To herself. To Derek. To anyone who had ever doubted her. She was not weak. She was not helpless. She was strong. And she was never alone. As she lay in bed that night, Max curled up on his blanket beside her. His breathing was slow. Steady. He was at peace. Sarah let out a deep breath. Derek wouldn't be back. And even if he was, she wasn't scared. Because Max would always be there. Waiting. Watching. Protecting. She closed her eyes, feeling safe. Justice had been served. And Sarah and Max had won.